Hi everyone, this video is a follow-up from my last video where I showed all of my different bread pans for whole grain sourdough baking. I went through all of those in detail and showed you my rather large collection. In this video, I'm going to show you how to work out bread recipes to fit your pans. Because if you're like me, you probably got different size pans and they hold different amounts of dough, and different styles of recipes need different volumes as well. So I'm going to show you the easy method that you can use to work this out, and it will give you a whole lot of freedom in your baking. It means that you can do what I do and just make up your bread recipes as you go really easily each time. You don't have to follow other people's recipes that don't fit your pans, or you can take other people's recipes and scale them to fit your pans. It makes it really easy. It does require a little bit of maths, you will need a calculator, but I'm going to show you really easy, break it down. It's not hard to do. The measurements that I'll be talking about in this video will be using the metric system, centimeters rather than inches, and bakers all around the world use the metric system to work out their bakers' percentages and their recipe ingredients, and there's a reason for that. It really is just such an elegant system for this application, and I encourage you to just kind of stick with me because I'm going to show you how well it works. So the first step is to get the volume of your bread pan. I'll just use this little German Aldi pan, folded steel pan as an example. The height is really easy. You just measure from top to bottom. We need to get the height, the length and the width of your pan. So the height is easy. For this one we've got 7.5 centimeters. So just measure that top to bottom and write that down. 7.5. And then we need the width and the length. So the width and the length are a bit more challenging because you can see on this pan, the length at the bottom of the pan is smaller than the length at the top of the pan, and same with the width because this is not a right angle, it's spread out at the top. So what you do to get around that is take your measurement from halfway up, and that gives you the average length of the whole pan, if that makes sense. So I just hold my ruler just about halfway up, and my length there is 19 centimeters. At the top it's 20.5, and at the bottom it's 18, but the average length for the pan there is 19, so that's what we want. And we do the same for the width, halfway up. It's pretty close to 10 centimeters, so I'll just write 10. So we've got our height, our length and our width, and then just in a calculator, very simply, type in 7.5 times 19 times 10, and they were all centimeters, and that gives you the number 1425. That number, 1425, and this is the beauty of the metric system, because we measured in centimeters, that number is cubic centimeters. We took our 3 measurements, we multiplied them by each other, and we end up with 1,425 cubic centimeters. So that's our volume of our pan in total. The beauty of the metric system is that 1 cubic centimeter, and I'll write this down, 1 centimeter cubed, which you would write like that, 1 centimeter cubed, is the same as 1 milliliter of liquid, of water. So the volume of 1 cubic centimeter is the same as 1 milliliter of water, which is also the same as 1 gram of water. So 1 gram of water, and this only works for water, but 1 gram of water is 1 milliliter of water, and the volume for that is 1 cubic centimeter. So with this pan, that means that if I filled this with liquid, it would hold 1,425 milliliters, and in litres that would be 1.425 litres. So that gives us an idea of our volume. So this is just about a 1.5 litre pan, for those of you who are familiar with litres. You don't need to worry about this for your bread recipes. I just wanted to show you that in case you weren't aware, and this is why the metric system is just, it is so easy to use. So we've got this 1,425 gram capacity for our pan. Once you know that total cubic centimetre or gram of water capacity for your pan, here's the formula. For 100% whole grain sourdough bread recipes that are fairly average, not, just baking in a pan, not putting them into a preheated cast iron or anything like that, which will give you a really explosive oven spring, just a general standard pan loaf, you want roughly about 40% of the capacity of your pan to be the flour amount in your recipe. I have tried this in all of my pans and it works. So you work out the total capacity for your pan, and for this one it's 1,425, and then I multiply 1,425 times 0.4, and that gives me the 40% amount. So 40% capacity of this pan is 570 grams. That's my flour amount for the recipe. So whenever I want to make bread in this pan, I use about 550 gram flour, or roughly, you can be really accurate if you want and use 570, but somewhere around 550 grams of flour makes a perfect loaf to fill this pan. If I do the same for this pan or any other open topped pan, it will work out the same. The total capacity for this pan, for example, is 1,645 grams, which means about a total of 650 grams makes a perfect loaf for this. And you can see it's a bit bigger than the other one. So just to go over it again, you take your length, your width, and your height of your pan in centimetres, multiply those each all together, and then when you get that total number, multiply that by 40% or 0.4, and that will give you the flour amount for your recipe. So this 40% volume rule works really, really well for 100% whole grain sourdough recipes. It will give you a nice rise above the pan. It won't be overflowing, it won't be too low, it'll be just about right. The only time where I wouldn't use 40% and I'd use a bit less flour for my recipe, and I'll show you how to work out the rest of the recipe in a second, because it's obviously more than flour. The only time you would use less flour for the recipe is if you are using a pan with a lid. I'm still testing out these USA Pullman pans, but for this pan, if you're using the lid, you want the dough to completely fill the pan up and touch the lid and fill out all the corners so you get that nice square shape. But if you use 40%, it's actually too much and it fills up the pan and it kind of looks nice, but the dough is a bit restricted because you've got a bit more dough in there than you actually need. And so your loaf is a little more dense than it should be. So I've found about 30% flour of the total volume works really well with these Pullman pans, but that will be probably my next video, is to show you a sandwich loaf recipe. But if you want to start calculating your own, take the total volume of this pan and multiply that by 30% and use that for your flour amount. The other instance where I would use, actually in this situation, I would use about 25% flour for this whole volume of this pan. The reason why is that it has a lid, so you don't want it to get so high that it's going to stick to the top of the lid. I do grease the lid of this and that has helped, which is good. But the main reason for this is that when I bake my loaf recipes in this, I preheat this. I make this really, really hot, and I proof my dough in a banneton and then put it in here. And because of that preheating, and this is clay, it gets super hot, I get an amazing oven spring and much more volume in my loaves when I bake with this preheated. So if I'm doing that method, I use about 30% or 20, even 25% flour recipe of this total volume of this pan. But if I'm not preheating this, if I'm just putting my dough in here to proof cold and then just using it like a normal loaf pan, I'd stick with the 40%, because it's only when you think you're going to get that really big explosive oven spring, that's when you obviously need a smaller recipe. Otherwise, it's going to be too much and it's going to hit the top. So I apologize, this is a little bit rough, but I wrote out the general rules for myself. I'll probably write this up for my website. So flour for a regular loaf pan, and this goes for whole grain sourdough bread making. With yeasted bread making or bread making that uses refined flours, you will need to use a lot less flour because you're going to get much more volume. It's generally 100% whole grain sourdough bread is a bit more dense. So 40% flour for regular loaf pans of the total pan volume. If you're expecting an explosive oven spring, use 25 to 30% flour. And for yeasted loaves, you will get, non-sourdough breads, you will get a much bigger oven spring as well, and just bigger volume generally. Use 20% flour of your total volume. Pullman pan about 30% so that it meets the lid. I'll write this up on my website, so don't worry if you didn't catch all of that. Now if we go back to this little steel pan as the example, now the final step is, okay, how do I work out the rest of my recipe? Because I need more than flour in my recipe. So we decided 40%, 550 grams of flour is going to be perfect for this tin. And I have tried that countless times and it works. So here's the basic baker's math. What we're talking about here is baker's percentages. And in this system, the flour amount of the recipe is always 100%. And we use the flour amount to then work out the other ingredients. For most whole grain, 100% whole grain, especially freshly milled flour, 100% whole grain bread recipes, they tend to be usually around 80 to 90% hydration. So to work that out, and I'll just stick with 80% for this recipe, we get our flour amount. And often when I'm making bread, I just have my calculator out and I work things out. So we've got 550 grams of flour. To get an 80% hydration amount, we multiply our flour amount times 0.8 to give 80%. And that gives us 440 grams of water, for 40 grams of water or other liquid, whatever you're using. And that's our 80%. So this is not a cumulative total, as you can see. We don't have 180% in total. We just have the water amount. All of the ingredients are expressed as a percentage of the total flour amount. So 440 grams of water. Usually with salt, you want somewhere between 1.5 to 2% salt. I like to go about 1.7 just to be finicky. So we got 550 grams of flour. Again, we start with the flour amount. We multiply that by 0.017 to get 1.7%. That gives us, I'll just say 9 grams of salt. I don't get that precise that I'm going to worry about 0.35 of a gram of salt. You could round that up to 10 grams if you want, or 9 grams of salt, whatever you like. That was about 1.7%. And then with seeds and any other additional things, I don't include them at all. For me, the most important thing in the recipe is the flour, the water, and the salt. And I have to confess, I don't even include my sourdough starter in my mathematics calculations for my bread recipes. Some people do, but it's a lot more complicated than the average home baker needs to know about. And as long as you're using a relatively small amount of starter, and for my bread recipes, I use anywhere between 50 to 100 grams of starter. Honestly, I don't even measure it. I just put it in from the small amount that I keep in my fridge and my jar, and I just add that to my recipe as an additional ingredient. Same with sweeteners like honey or anything else you might want to add to your bread, which I rarely do anyway. I tend to make just lean doughs. I just add those as additional ingredients. So those are not included in the basic math calculation. And that's the way that I've been working out my whole grain sourdough bread recipes for many, many, many years, and it has held me in really good stead. If you want to use much larger starter amounts or levain, depending on what language you're using, if you want to use a lot larger portions of that, then you will have to figure that into your recipe. But I just keep my recipes really simple. I use my 50 to 100 grams, just like half a cup, third of a cup of starter from the fridge, add that onto my recipes, and don't worry about factoring that into the calculations. So all I need is my flour amount. From there, I calculate my water, which might be 90%, depends on the flour. So the liquid amount really depends on the flour that you're using, and that's where your experience and being guided by other recipes can help you to learn what type of hydration. But generally, I think freshly milled flour, 100% whole grain sourdough needs a pretty good hydration amount. If you are adding things like seeds, psyllium husk, or anything else that's really absorbent to your recipe, it might be ground linseed or anything like that, pumpkin seeds, any sorts of seeds or anything else that is going to soak up water in your recipe, that's when I would tend to use a higher water amount. But generally speaking, for me, usually with most of my whole wheat, whole spelt, rye, they all tend to be around 80 to 90%. I tend to err on the side of more hydration than less. So just one more time, basic method is get your pan, take the length, the width and the height, multiply those by each other to give you the total cubic centimeter volume or the total gram volume. Multiply that by 40% if you're just baking in an open pan like this. If you're baking in a pan with a lid or something that you're going to preheat, you're going to get a big oven spring, multiply that by 25 or 30% to give you your flour volume. And then once you have your flour volume, calculate 80% of that total flour volume to give you your water amount, and then 1.5 to 2% amount of that to give you your salt volume, and then just add your starter on top of that. So this has been a pretty quick basic rundown, but I hope that makes sense to you, and I hope that helps you to get started making the perfect bread recipes for your pans. Once you know how to do this, you will have total freedom in your bread baking. You won't be reliant on other people's recipes that don't fit your pans very well. And you will just have so much more fun because you'll probably be maybe like me where I don't even use recipes. I never use recipes. I don't even use my own recipes. I just make up my bread on the day pretty much from scratch, just knowing what my volume I need for my tin. And it depends on what flours I have on hand, what I feel like. I just work it out. I get my little calculator out. You can work this out for yourself in a chart and just have a few standard recipes that you can use as a guide for yourself. That's a really good trick as well. All right, thanks everyone. I hope that helped. Please let me know in the comments if you've got any questions, and happy baking. I'll see you next time.